It was piled high with sweaters and scarves and parkas and every kind of winter wrap imaginable. Ratso left his sheepskin on the stack and looked over the rows of boots and galoshes and rubbers on the floor. "I'll pick me out a nice pair of rubbers when we leave," he said. The door was wide open. Ratso led the way in. Joe felt painfully self-conscious, not knowing what behavior was expected of him. He walked with a swagger, frowning, not wanting to be caught without an attitude. The room was enormous. It ran the entire length of the building, and it was as wide as a house. There was a good deal of noise, but not enough so for large a crowd. Laughter was aware of itself, and so was conversation, and there was a certain timidity in the sounds produced by a bongo drum, a recorder, and a jug, suggesting that the musicians had not yet hit any kind of stride. One couple was making an effort to dance, and an even greater effort to do so without being seen. There were many small groups, some standing, some sitting on the floor, all loosely formed, and many persons standing alone or near the periphery of a group that did not quite include them. One couple, boys of college age, one white, one brown, sat in the middle of the floor holding hands, but it wasn't so much an interracial romance as a marriage of two shades of despair. They were joined at the hands, but not at the eyes. Each of them frowned into some distance of his own. Many of the lone persons, male and female alike, seemed to be ashamed of their solitary condition. You could see them casting about for a place to lose it, a way to camouflage it, or something to attach it to. A drink, a cigarette, a corner, a conversation, a smile, a stranger, an attitude. Along one wall was a big table with a good selection of cheese and lunch meat and crackers and bread, and on the floor next to it were wash tubs filled with ice water, and cans of beer. At the far end of the room, Joe spotted the McAlbertsons sitting on the floor at the feet of a skinny painted lady with long white hair. Behind this trio, covering a portion of wall from ceiling to floor, were several long strips of butcher paper on which had been painted in black the legend, "It's later than you think." And next to the sign was a bucket of black paint with a broom sitting in it, the handle leaning against the wall. Joe kept looking at the McAlbertsons. They sat before the sign like figures on an altar, quietly and with that same unholy tranquility that had caught his interest earlier at Nedick's. The lady behind them was even more disturbing to him. He didn't like looking at her, but his eyes kept returning to her on their own. There was something wrong with her. But what? She had a blob of dark paint on each eye, and a little red mouth. She blinked often. The lids of her eyes seemed to be operated by strings in the control of someone whose attention had wandered. Her head sat upon her neck in a loose way, precariously balanced, bobbing about like a toy maker's trick. seen from a distance. She might even have been inhuman. Something pasted together by those two silent, sinister children at her feet. An effigy, perhaps, of a missing parent, made from sticks and straw, candy sacks and Crayolas. The boy had some jars in front of him, and he was shaking something out of one of them. A spider? A worm? And handing it to a beautiful Negro girl. Whatever it was, the girl popped it into her mouth, downed it with beer, and then, in a comic imitation of sensual pleasure, she stretched her arms, wiggled her lean, jersey-clad body, and danced across the center of the room into the arms of a splendid black giant, gaining and holding the attention of nearly every other person in the place. But Joe watched the McAlbertson boy, who was still preoccupied with those little jars. He drew closer, hoping for a look at their contents, when the one called Gretel caught his eye and beckoned to him with her head. Joe turned to get some guidance from Ratso, but Ratso was busy at the refreshment table, looking about furtively and stuffing his pockets with salami. Gretel McAlbertson, meanwhile, had risen and come toward Joe. Her face and voice were completely without expression. From close on, she was less sinister, and her tranquility might even have been simple boredom. "You're here," she said. "Do you need anything? I mean, there's beer," and she opened a fist and showed him a big brown capsule. "This, if you want it." Reading the question in his face, she said, "It's a bomber. Good for about 2 hours." Joe looked at the capsule, and then at the girl, smiling to cover his ignorance and wondering what to do. She frowned slightly. "Well, take it," she said, her tone somewhere between a command and a dare. Joe took the capsule and popped it into his mouth, worked up some saliva, and swallowed it. Proud of himself, he smiled and looked to the girl for some sign of appreciation or approval. But all his bravado seemed only to have deepened her boredom. She pointed a languid hand toward the refreshment table. "Beer's all right with it," she said. This time there was something in her voice. Gentleness, perhaps. Ratso was at the moment approaching with 2 open beer cans. He handed one of them to Joe. Joe tried to perform an introduction. "This here is, Ratso Rizzo," and Ratso corrected him. "Rico," he said. But this sort of routine was clearly too taxing for Gretel McAlbertson, who had wandered away. Joe took a good deep swallow of the beer and wondered what to expect of the capsule. "If you want the word on that brother and sister act," Ratso said, "I'll give you the word. Hansel's a fag, and Gretel's got the hots for herself. So who cares, right?" He thrust a thumb into the air in the direction of the refreshment table. "They got salami up to here, so put some in your pocket already." Joe felt himself being stared at. He turned to look, and there, standing in front of the bathroom door, was a girl in an orange dress, smiling at him in a dark, provocative frame in a manner that made the bathroom seem to be her very own tent on a technicolor desert, or perhaps she shared it with other members of the harem. She met his eyes boldly, opening her own even wider, and then bared her teeth and gave a mad little thrill of a laugh. Running her fingers through her rich black hair, she came toward him. Joe liked her body. It was slim-legged, but thickly sensual, built close to the ground. She said, "I can tell, can't you?" "Yeah," Joe victed. "Hell yeah, I can tell." "Well then," she said, "what'll we do? Leave now, or what? Have you got a place? Because I've got this damned roommate." "Well, that doesn't matter. I can fix it. Because we have this arrangement." "Oh, God." "The second I looked at you, I knew. Did you know right away?" "Did I know, that we were going to make it?" Ratso spoke up. "You really want to do business, don't you, lady?" Obviously, the woman hadn't noticed Ratso. She looked at him with surprise. "Who are you?" "Oh, God, don't tell me you two are a couple." "I happen to be his manager," said Ratso. "And he happens to be Joe Buck, a very expensive stud." "Expensive? Expensive?" Her mouth dropped open. She looked away, blinked, looked at Ratso again, and then at Joe. "Is it true?" "Well now," Joe began to hedge. "Oh, God," she cried. "It is! I can't believe it." She wandered away, and not escaping, just stupefied. She opened a beer for herself, then leaned against the refreshment table, looking at the tall cowboy, shaking her head, blinking. Ratso said, "She's hooked. I'd say she was good for $10, but I'll ask for 20. Joe said, "Listen, money or no money, I could use some of that." "Oh, hell yeah. You're rich. Go talk to her. I'll move in later." Ratso walked away. Joe was beginning to feel weightless. He rolled his shoulders in slow circles, as if to test his ability to move, and found that he had some new possession of his body. It had become remarkable to him again, a thing of grace and power. And he even experienced that old longing for a mirror. The black-haired woman was at his side, looking up at him, as if there were a vast difference in height between them. "I'm terribly excited," she said. "This is the first time in my life I've ever been confronted by, well, what I've ever even heard of, the mere existence of this sort of a situation. And I'm, frankly, terribly excited. I can't wait to tell my man, but I don't have an appointment till Monday. Isn't that rotten? Listen, I'm just speculating, but what would happen if I said, okay, I'm buying?" Ooh, the woman suddenly shuddered. She had a fine, handsome nose, the nostrils dilated. She was breathing in short gasps. "I'm embarrassed," she said, "and this is not Dexedrine. I've had my weight in Dexedrine, and it never did this to me. I should definitely take notes. The breathing, the heart, the stomach, and look, goose pimples." She showed him her arm. Joe smiled modestly. "What is this? Buying a man? Is that it? Well, I guess it's the most thrilling thing I've ever heard of. It's like, well, you take virginity. That's one end of something. And on the other, absolute opposite, farthest, most utterly distant pole is buying a lover, I suppose. Isn't it? Of course. Leave us face this. I am a long way from virginity. That was never my problem. It's just that way, way, way back years ago, I used to think I had to marry everybody I had an affair with. Primitive. She laughed, but her laughter did not interfere with the flow of her speech. But after 3 husbands, count 'em 3, my man finally got it through his thick skull that I had become a perfect, living, walking example of Bronx morality in its most stifling form. Are you with me? Then, breakthrough. And what do? I began to act as if I have to have an affair with everybody I go to bed with. Don't you see? Just a very transparent extension of the same old morality bit. You have to agree, because what's an affair but marriage sans mumbo-jumbo? I mean, emotionally, you're taking just as much punishment, aren't you? From a lover as from a husband. No argument there. Good. So, suddenly it dawned on me, what, if you please, is wrong with just plain old sex? I was sure this is what my man had been getting at. Of course, they don't say it straight out. It has to come from you. Which, if you're as dumb as I am, and I can be awfully dumb in certain departments, can be terribly expensive. Let's just not think about what this thing has cost me in terms of good hard cash. Okay? Anyway, I began to, well, walk through a few things, just trying my legs. And baby, it was nowhere. I couldn't even reach a climax. Then, tonight, when I came out of that bathroom and saw you, pure symbol, that's what you are. Symbol, oh yes, pure symbol, nothing more, nothing less. You didn't know that. I can't believe it. Anyway, I knew I was going to make a real breakthrough. No thinking either, my dear. Feeling, just feeling. You see the state I'm in, don't you? And didn't I walk right up to you? Well, I can tell you, I've never done that before. What do you think I am? I simply had this feeling, and there was nothing I could do about it. And furthermore, I didn't want to do anything about it. Oh, when the time comes, naturally, I'll have to ask myself, why do I choose a cowboy? And second, why a cowboy war? But not tonight. No, sir. Being analytical during is the kiss of death. Your orgasm goes right out the window. Kiss me right now, will you? Before we talk the whole thing away. Hey, listen. Would it embarrass you if I turned on this great big glaring ceiling light over my bed and looked at you all over? Because I've never really studied a man completely. I mean, every square inch of him. And I'm dying to. May I? I mean, aren't peculiar requests a part of your profession? expression. And incidentally, how much is this going to cost me anyway? Two. Joe watched the woman speak, but his hearing wasn't working in the usual way. All her talk might have been rain, and there was glass between them. He heard her words, and he saw them, but they never got to him. What he did hear was something that had to do with the capsule. He'd swallowed a high, thin, private sound, not really a sound at all. You could just easily picture it. Say it was a high wire he had flown to at some altitude that caused a blending of all the senses, sight, sound, touch, making them one. At one such moment, he chose to see the party from this altitude, saw COWBOY himself, looking past a jumble of faceless party figures toward the end of the room, where two young people in black sat on the floor at the feet of a woman. But from this point of view, these three people were not three at all. They were four, and one of them was himself. He belonged there with them. He was Joe Buck, the cowboy, and there was his blonde sitting with the two beautiful children. Now, of course, it was clear to him why he had been invited to the party. He was the missing member of something. Always had been. But now everything would be straightened out. There was a comment at the other end of the room. Heads turned to watch what appeared to be the introduction of some sort of entertainment. The bongo player produced a drum roll, and the girl on the recorder did her best to imitate a fanfare. The Albertsons, meanwhile, helped their lady to her feet. She seemed to be either drunk or drugged. But once on her feet, she was able to walk under her own power, giving the effect of an imperfectly operated marionette. There was the clank and tinkle and jangle of costume jewelry as she pushed dozens of bracelets from her wrist up towards her elbows and made her way to the center of the room. Joe believed that this was the moment at which the purpose of the evening would be made clear to others, as was to him. A kind of wedding was taking place. A wedding of a somewhat unusual sort, more a reunion with which the principals had a deeper, more mysterious than usual kinship with one another. The fact that he had never actually seen these three people before tonight did not seem at all contradictory. His chimerical vision was such that any rupture in the usual logic of things achieved at once a new and higher order of fitness all its own. For instance, what happened next was in a certain sense impossible, but nevertheless, he saw it take place. The white-haired woman took one sweeping gaze at the people gathered there, and as she did so, her eye touched upon Joe's for a moment, and then moved on. He trembled, and his entire body went cold with shock, for in that moment he had been looked upon by Sally Buck. She was much older now, and more outlandish than he had view of her, and he knew now that it was his grandmother, returned from the grave, who had sent those two sad as death, poisonously pretty children into the streets of New York to search for him. And for what purpose? To tell him something urgent, of course. And here it was. The message was about to be spoken. The MacAlbertsons, looking for all the world like dream children, slender and neuter in their tight black clothing, clearly the sort of young you'd send as messengers from the grave, had drawn close to the old lady, perhaps to catch her if she fell, or to lend some other form of support. And now she raised her hands in a bid for attention, and when everyone was quiet, her hands flew to her face and she began to giggle and cough. She seemed to have forgotten what she was supposed to say. There followed a quick huddle with the MacAlbertsons. Joe's harem woman, the one in the orange dress, asked him why he was perspiring, but Joe didn't seem to hear the question. And then she said, "I think you ought to eat something, because the trick is to keep eating. Don't you know that? Shall I get you a sandwich?" He said something to her, and she went away. Now both the old lady and the girl were pointing at the boy called Hansel. Every eye in the room followed his movements as he painted a great black X on the sign, canceling out the words, "It's later than you think." He replaced the broom in the bucket and joined his sister. The two of them nodded at the old woman, restoring to her the attention of the room. She made more noises with her bracelets and coughed up some phlegm, which she spat into a handkerchief tucked into her waist. Then she held up one hand for silence, waited for it, got it, and spoke in a loud, flat, shaky Midwestern drawl. "It's not later than you think. Nothin' more. It isn't." She paused, sucking in her cheeks and pursing her lips, as if they were too dry for more speech. The effect was of a series of quick, desperate kisses being sent into the air of the party. Gretel MacAlbertson gave her a sip of beer. The woman licked her lips and gasped, then suddenly shouted, "Time!" holding both hands motionless in the air and seeming to suspend the very commodity under discussion. There was another series of coughing spasms. The party waited in silence for a moment, but slowly a murmuring started and grew, and Joe heard a man say, "She'd rather be here than in some doorway. Besides, she's too far gone to know what they're doing to her." And a woman answered, "Oh, don't tell me she doesn't know. I think it's cruel. These people still have minds, no matter how far gone they are." The old woman nodded again, with the MacAlbertsons obviously being coached by them. Then she faced the gathering once more and suddenly shouted, She was taking a bow. The Albertsons applauded. Everyone joined in. The noise grew to absurd, thunderous proportions, was further increased by whistles, shouting, foot-stomping, and even 2 or 3 screams. Ratso was at Joe's side, nudging him with his elbow. "How come you're clapping?" "What the hell was that supposed to be? A song and a dance? I thought they were gonna make her bite the head off a chicken at least." Joe moved away from Ratso, threading his way through the noise, stepping over spread-out legs and around crossed knees and cocktail tables and benches and musicians, closer and closer to the old woman, who had returned by now to her chair behind the Albertsons. The dark lady in orange suddenly appeared in his path, holding in both hands a big, thick sandwich. "I thought you wanted this," she said. Joe said, "Thanks," but he didn't take the sandwich. He touched her shoulder. She stepped aside. He continued to move toward the old woman. He felt that the party had suddenly gone wrong. A moment ago, he had known something important about his life had come clear to him, and then he had forgotten it. Or perhaps he had only been on the brink of knowing, and it had been withheld from him by this old lady. Who was she? He studied her from this close range and found her to be even older than she had appeared during the entertainment. She was apparently in pain, too, seemed to have been not silly by it. Her forehead was creased with a network of tensions and lines. The face powder she wore covered some kind of skin eruption. Her eyes, blinking constantly, seemed never to have known rest. They were the quivering blooms of some endless suffering whose beginnings had long ago been forgotten. At odd moments, an inner contraction caused her to wince, as if she had been kicked. Her eyes would remain closed for a moment, and her face would buckle into a mess of painted creases, like an exploded candy sack. Joe tried to remember just what it was he had come to ask of the old lady, or of the McAlbertsons for that matter. He stood right in front of them, but they paid no attention to him whatever. They seemed to have no power to look upon anything or anyone except one another. And Joe himself was no longer able to see them from high up. His special sense had somehow gone dead on him. He no longer felt any kinship with these people. They were just a pretty boy and a pretty girl and a sick old lady trying to have a party. He always wondered about parties, and now he was attending one, and he didn't much like it. If this was any sample, parties were even sadder than the streets were. A big man with a shiny round face grabbed Joe's arm and said, "Didn't you hear what Mother Carey's said?" "She said you ticked your last tick-tock, so lay down, baby. You're dead." The man laughed and moved on to someone else, saying, "Did you hear what I said to that guy? I said, didn't you hear what Mother Ceres said? She said." Joe went at once into action. He moved quickly to the man's side, took hold of him with both arms, and said, "Hey, how come you picked me?" "Pick you," said the man You're crazy, the man said. Let go of my arm. I ain't hurting your arm. I want an answer, Joe said. Gretel McAlbertson was standing there. Thanks for coming, she said to Joe. But we want you to go now. Ratso was there too, he said. What are you, bombed? Then to the McAlbertsons, he said. He's just bombed, that's all. As Ratso led him from the room and into the hallway, Joe said, I'm not bombed. I was, but I'm not. Ratso's coat had got buried. He began to rummage around for it. Joe said, I'm in a mess, is what I'm in. I'm in a big mess, and I got to fuck my way out of it. Ratso said, I feel crummy. I gotta lie down. The woman with the orange dress appeared in the doorway. Hey. Joe looked at her, and she said, I asked you how much, didn't I? Joe kept his eye on the woman as he said, Tell her, Ratso. Ratso said, $20. The woman said, Sold. Mine's the dyed molten under the gray herringbone. Let's go. Ratso said, and taxi fare for me. 20 for him, and taxi fare for me, okay? The woman said, You know what I think? I think you ought to get lost. Bad lost, you know, like dead. I agree, Ratso said. And for that service, I charge $1 for taxi fare. The woman took $1 from a small roll in her bosom and handed it to him. When I count 10, be gone. 1, 2, 3. Ratso started down the stairs. Joe helped the woman into her coat. Hey, he said, what's your name, honey? Oh, she said, you don't know, do you? I love that. But I know yours is Joe. Which is fabulous. Joe could be just anybody. Kiss me, Joe. Hold me, Joe. Move over, Joe. Go away, Joe. Marvy. A perfect name for a male. Person. Sort of like Rose for a girl. Below them was the sound of someone falling downstairs. Joe ran down the 2 flights, 2 steps at a time, and found Ratso on the first floor struggling with the banister, trying to pull himself to his feet. And then he took a second fall. Joe picked him up, and Ratso gave instructions on how he was to be lowered to the floor. Joe lowered him onto his stronger leg. Ratso clung to the newel post, his teeth clenched and his face dead white. The woman had arrived by now on the second landing. As she descended the final flight of steps, she said, What's the matter? He fell, Joe said. Is he all right? What are you, smart? Ratso said, then mimicked. Is he all right? Well, if you're all right, she said, why are you hanging onto the banister? Can you walk or not? Can I walk? Naturally, I can walk. He took 3 steps, catching himself at the door. What do you call that? Yeah, Joe said. But to the subway? No. I'm infirm. I'll never make it, Ratso imitated a damsel. Carry me. The woman said, He's got taxi fare. She turned Yeah, already? He's all right, the woman told Joe. Let's go. Three. An hour later, the woman was lying with her head supported on her elbow, touched at Joe with her free hand. That happens, she said. Don't worry about it. I mean, are you worried about it? Well, don't be. Why don't we just sort of lie here and see what happens? Maybe even nap a little, huh? Joe reached across the bed and took a cigarette from the nightstand. That's something that never happened to me before. You can bet your bottom dollar on that. Where's the matches, ma'am? In the top drawer. While Joe lit his cigarette, she said, maybe if you didn't call me ma'am, things worked out better. Joe lay on his back and blew smoke up toward the ceiling. First goddamn time that thing ever quit on me. A short laugh came from the woman. Joe looked at her quickly. What? You think I'm lying? She made an effort to straighten her face out. No, of course not. Something struck me funny, that's all. Yeah, Joe said. Well, what was that? But it's nothing. Nothing, huh? Oh, please now, honestly. Joe nodded his head and looked at the ceiling again. All right, I'll tell you, she said. Suddenly, I just put myself in your shoes and I realized that being a professional, well, that must be what really bothers you about a thing like this. Not Not that you should be bothered because it's merely human, but I had this sudden awful picture of a bugler without a horn, or a policeman without a stick, etc., etc., and I think I better shut up. I'm making it worse. Joe's mind was working hard. He was turning over all the possible reasons for his failure, thinking of all the ways in which he had been weakened and wearied since his arrival in New York, and thinking of it, he felt the weakness, the weariness, like something running through him in place of blood. Little by little, the city had been drawing all that could choose from him, a little here, a little there, everything going out nearly every second of the day, the sidewalks at every step, drawing something out of him through his feet, the traffic noises sucking at his ears, the neon signs pulling something vital from his eyes, and nothing much coming in. Coffee here, soup there, now and then a plate of wet spaghetti, a hamburger made of spiced sawdust, a bottle of beer, and none of it nourishing to anything in him except this weariness. When he awakened, there were streaks of daylight at the edges of the window shades, the same thoughts of himself being weakened, rushed through his head now with a kind of dream continuity. He saw himself being drained and robbed and swindled in 1,000 impossible ways. Every smile cost him some ungodly sum, and every time he nodded in assent to a stranger, a vital substance was exacted from him. If a clock ticked, or a breeze blew, or a wheel turned in his presence, within range of his senses, it seemed somehow to have stolen his energy to fuel itself. She bit his shoulder to earn more of this splendid wrath, and he had to cup his hand over her mouth and press on it hard to muzzle those teeth, and he continued to work and to work and to work and to work, and the woman's eyes were wild, and she mooned through his hand and slobbered in the palm of it and worked her mouth against it, and with her body she said, "Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah," and met everything he had to say with his, and they had established a kind of dogged and laborious and insistent fight between them. But she wanted more anger, and so she clawed at his back with her fingernails, and Joe knew she'd brought blood out of him, and he was being drained again. Now they were taking his blood, but this time he'd caught them in the act. Well, he'd show them, and so he drove at her harder and deeper and deeper and deeper, and now there were tears coming from the woman's eyes, and all her breath came and went from her, accompanied by some animal noise that was more vicious than a growl. And he took his hand away from her mouth and looked at her, and saw that her face was something terrible, and so he called her something terrible, and that helped her. Something broke inside of her, and she began to laugh and cry, alternating rapidly between the two like a mad woman, and it was clear to Joe Buck that the woman knew she was going to have her freedom, and he labored with greater and greater insistence to deliver it to her, not because he wanted her free, but because he wanted to feel himself the deliverer, wanted to know that power again in himself. And then there was a long, low cry, like a deliberate scream coming from her, and he kept on for a moment as if he wanted to sign his name in blood and with a flourish to what he had done. And in doing this, something unexpected happened. He himself was set free, and then he allowed all of his weight to rest upon the woman. She kept her arms around him, smeared with her hand the blood she had drawn from his back, and she kept telling him over and over again the most common name for the act they had performed, as if the experience might improved or prolonged or even somehow immortalized in the dirty naming of it. And as Joe lay upon her, his eyes deep in the pillow, the two young people in black walked into his mind, slender and blonde and plain as day, the McAlbertsons, and for a moment briefly, while the woman recited her obscene litany of small words, he looked at these children in his mind and entered into their mystery, saw them come into being full grown before his eyes, saw them walking hand in hand against a backdrop of nothingness, together but unjoined, motherless and fatherless, and without real gender, unconnected to the world or to who they themselves were or where or what. Saw them wandering in search of others, passing through the same empty regions, others born loose and alien and unconnected as they themselves were. And in this brief clarity, Joe Buck had a sense of knowing just who the children were. His own offspring, born full grown from this very night's union.